What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 489. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I don't have quite as much on today's show as I've had the past few episodes. It has been really busy trying to cover the war in Gaza. And so I'm going to have some, of course, updates on what's happening in Israel, some news on Venezuela, some news on North Korea. But hopefully I'll be able to keep this show under an hour. I know last week I put out 4 shows and they were all pretty long, so this one will hopefully be just a little bit shorter. Let's start off this week by catching up on some news last week that I just didn't have the time to get to. First up here, I wrote this for the Institute on October 19th. U.S. lifts some sanctions on Venezuela, resumes deportation flights. So the Joe Biden administration eased some sanctions on Venezuela's energy and gold sector after President Nicolas Maduro agreed to hold elections next year. At the same time, Washington resumed deporting Venezuelan migrants. On Wednesday, the Treasury announced easing of the economic war on Venezuela. And this is from the press release. The United States welcomes the signing of an electoral roadmap agreement between the Unitary Platform and Maduro representatives, consistent with U.S. sanctions policy. In response to these democratic developments, the U.S. Department of Treasury has issued a general license authorizing transactions involving Venezuela's oil and gas and gold sector, as well as removing the ban on secondary trading. So these are limited. I think about 6 months is the reprieve that Venezuela and their companies get here. Now, a couple of important things to mention, of course, is anytime the U.S. is lifting sanctions, they are pretty quick to throw them back on. And so I do think, one concern and something that we have to stay aware of is that, this could be undone at any time. And so, and I'm sure the companies that are potentially considering engaging in trade with Venezuela are aware of this phenomenon as well, and will be hesitant to engage in trade with Venezuela. Second point is, I'm not quite sure there's anything here that shows Venezuela did anything to really change its policy. Maduro has held elections under international elections observers before and has won those elections. And as a libertarian, I certainly wouldn't want to live in communist Venezuela. I see a lot of problems with Maduro and his government. At the same time, that's for the Venezuelan people to decide. In no way should be decisions made in the White House. And so, another concern that I have is that you're going to end up with a situation here that basically if the Venezuelan people go out and vote the way they want to vote next year, they're going to vote for Maduro. And then the U.S. is going to re-sanction Venezuela saying, see, Maduro won again. It wasn't a fair election, which is, of course, not true. They just say that anytime the preferred American candidate didn't win. So looking back at how this economic war really got ramped up, of course, sanctions start coming under Obama, but under the Donald Trump administration, Washington backed a coup by Juan Guaido against Maduro. After Guaido failed to gain popular support in Venezuela, the U.S. enacted sweeping sanctions on the country with the goal of causing the Maduro administration to collapse and to destroy the Venezuelan economy. The sanctions did not threaten Maduro's government, but did cause widespread suffering among the Venezuelan people. The American economic war is estimated to have contributed to tens of thousands of Venezuelan deaths. The Biden administration has now issued a 6-month license to temporarily authorize sanctions and temporary authorized transactions involving the oil and gas sectors, issued a secondary license authorizing dealings with the Venezuelan state-owned gold mining company, and amended 2 relevant licenses to remove the secondary trading ban on certain Venezuelan sovereign bonds, the Treasury explained. The Treasury Department added that all other sanctions will remain in place. And just before lifting the sanctions, the White House resumed deportation flights to Venezuela, with over 100 migrants arriving in Venezuela on Wednesday. And then the Mets round was scheduled for Saturday, and I should have double checked before I did this show, but I'm not sure if that flight happened. And I do wonder if this is at least a part of why the Joe Biden administration is trying to make nice with Maduro and Venezuela, is they are really looking to get some more energy, oil on the market to keep gas prices at least sustainable, not extremely high level leading up to 2024. Of course, that would probably be a major blow for the Democrats and the Joe Biden administration should we have particularly high gas prices around the time of the election. And so I guess that's a goal of it. Also, look, feel how you want to feel about immigration and migration into the U.S. if you're pro or against that. I'm really not looking into getting that debate right now. I just, want to point out that there is whether you want to call it a humanitarian crisis or a security crisis, there is a crisis going on the American southern border, and there's a growing number of Venezuelans showing up as the American sanctions had absolutely obliterated the Venezuelan economy. People are looking to move and to get away from that, and so some of them are showing up in the U.S. They've also heavily migrate to other South American countries as well. And so the Biden administration, I guess, is looking to relieve the humanitarian situation at the southern border some, and has scheduled to start deporting Venezuelans. I suspect that the Haiti policy is somewhat the same. The reason they're trying to quote unquote restore order there is they just need somewhere to ship the Haitians. All right, as I mentioned on the last show, I've had some news on North Korea over the past week that I just haven't had time to get to. And yesterday at the Libertarian Institute, I wrote this article kind of summarizing what's going on there. U.S. nuclear bomber engages in trilateral war games with Japan and South Korea. The U.S., South Korea, and Japan kicked off their first ever aerial war games near the Korean Peninsula. The move is sure to heighten tensions between the bloc and North Korea. Pyongyang has warned that Washington was creating a real possibility of nuclear war by deploying strategic weapon platforms to the peninsula. On Sunday, a U.S. nuclear-capable B-52 bomber engaged in operations in the with South Korea and the Japanese aircraft. The three countries held naval drills last week, but this week's war games are the first aerial exercises between the three states. Last week's naval war games were the first held by the three nations in 7 years. The war games are a result of a U.S. policy to try to build ties between its Asian partners in order to confront North Korea and China. Earlier this year, President Joe Biden brought his Japanese and South Korean counterparts to Camp David and inked a trilateral deal to increase joint military exercises. Tensions on the Korean Peninsula have sharply increased since Biden took office. The U.S. and South Korea conducted a series of record-large war games, provoking North Korea to conduct dozens of missile tests. Pyongyang views the deployment of U.S. nuclear-capable weapon systems to Korea and trilateral war games between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo as particularly threatening to North Korea's national security. In a fiery address to the UN General Assembly, North Korea's representative to the body, Kim Song, blasted the U.S. for pushing the world towards nuclear war. Then we had North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un say last week that Washington had created a new Cold War, and Pyongyang said it would develop its nuclear deterrent to a higher level in response. And so, this is all pretty much what we've been predicting and talking about on the show over the past 2 years as Biden has taken over the Korea policy, where Trump's Korea policy was not perfect. I am not trying to praise what Donald Trump did. In a lot of ways, he really set the stage for this deterioration in relationship under the Biden administration. The relationship between the U.S. and North Korea was already on a downswing by the time that Trump left office. However, it was salvageable. The Trump administration was going to the DMZ in 2020, and so there was the potential for this at least not to escalate into another possible war. And The Biden administration just has completely blown up the Trump policy. A part of it is that during the Trump administration, his South Korean counterpart was Moon Jae-in, who really did believe and really wanted peace on the Korean Peninsula. Now we have Yoon Suk-yeol as president of South Korea, who is an avid hawk, who really does want more American military presence, more American nuclear capable weapons platforms being deployed to the Korean Peninsula. Now, I really don't think there's a lot of understanding in Washington, and this is really concerning, about how far they've pushed North Korea and how heightened the risk of war is. So I think a lot of the Korea policy, or a lot of the policy of, conducting these trilateral war games and making Japan and South Korea closer, is really about China and Taiwan and having more military assets in the region to confront China. However, North Korea is also, an enemy in the eyes of the American state, and they see themselves, the North Koreans see themselves in a confrontation with Washington. Of course, the Korean War has been an armistice for decades, but isn't officially over, and so the North Koreans are very concerned about this. And being a weaker state than China, these, I think, are far more serious provocations to Pyongyang than Beijing. And I don't think that is recognized in the White House. Essentially, how far they've pushed this policy and how far they plan to push this policy. And even if that policy, is eyeing China, the consequences on the Korean Peninsula, I believe, are going to be huge and potentially disastrous. All right, time to move on to talk about the war in Israel. And I'll start off here. On the last show, we kind of broke down and discussed this idea that the Biden administration is planning a $105 billion arms package with arms being sent to Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and a beef up of the southern border. On Friday, we officially got that legislation rolled out, and I wrote this article for antiwar.com. White House seats $105 billion to arm Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. On Friday, the White House rolled out its proposed $105 billion bill to arm Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. The legislation includes funding for the border and humanitarian assistance. U.S. officials say over $50 billion would go towards American arms manufacturers. The Biden administration is proposing a massive aid package as it has struggled to get Congress to appropriate more funds directly to the proxy war in Ukraine. The largest portion of the money in the bill is for Ukraine at $61.4 billion. The White House wants enough money for Ukraine to fund Kiev's war effort through the 2024 election. Now, I tried to look and find it, but I couldn't find the exact breakdown of where that's going to be security versus financial assistance. If we look at previous packages, I think it's about 3/4. And if we look at the recent one that was proposed by Biden that he wanted Congress to pass, I think it was a little bit north of a third, 2/3 was going to go towards military aid. So I'm guessing that number is between 40 and 45 billion. Could be a little bit higher, could be a little bit lower. But again, I think between 2/3 and 3/4 of that $61 billion will be going towards military assistance for Ukraine. And then we had National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan describing the aid as crucial to American national security and demanded Congress pass the bill. He said this budget request is critical to the advancement of America's national security and ensuring the safety of the American people. The world is closely watching what Congress does next. Israel will receive $14.3 billion in assistance, with $10.6 billion earmarked for air and missile defense support. The aid would be in addition to the $3.8 billion Tel Aviv receives from Washington in security assistance annually. And so, at least with Ukraine, you understand how Kiev is dependent on Washington. With Tel Aviv, it's a completely different story. This is, I think, in a lot of ways, just to rally Americans around this war in the Middle East, to get more Americans on board with what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And so I think this is a real problem. Biden announced the legislation in a speech on Thursday night. He said American leadership is what holds the world together. American allies are what keeps us in America safe. American values are what make us a partner nation you want to work with. To put that all at risk, we walk away from Ukraine, we turn our backs on Israel. It's just not worth it. That's why tomorrow I'm going to send Congress an urgent budget request to fund America's national security needs to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine. So huge things here. First, especially with Ukraine and Taiwan, funding and arming these countries makes Americans significantly less safe, not more safe. It destroys the relationship between Washington and Moscow and Beijing, the three world's largest powers, the two largest military powers. Beijing has a nuclear triad. And specifically, what we are doing here is we are crossing Russian and Chinese red lines when we're talking about arming Taiwan and Ukraine. And to them, to, Beijing and Moscow, Putin and Xi are sitting there in their capitals going, America is creating a massive national security threat to Russians and Chinese. This is a huge issue. And if you look at where these things are taking place, you could see that the liar here is Joe Biden, saying that this is a national security threat to America. It's not. These countries are looking to operate within their spheres of influence. In Taiwan, an island that has long been part of the, Chinese political sphere, and which Beijing claims to, and which Washington even admits is a part of China. So, that's a big issue there. And then, of course, with Ukraine, the Russians have been stating basically since the end of the Cold War, but, really since the Bush administration, shouting and yelling and saying like, hey, if you put weapons, if you arm Ukraine, that means that, American missiles are just minutes away from Moscow. American forces are able to roll into Russian territory at any time. And this is a real security threat to our country. And then, of course, with Israel, there's a couple things. One, as we talk about, Israel is an apartheid state, and Washington should turn its back from at least giving military support to countries that use those weapons to abuse people who live within those countries. And this isn't just talking about Israel. We should go to Egypt when we should strip away their $1.3 billion in annual aid. The Jordanians get hundreds of millions of dollars. We should take that away from them. The Saudis and the Emirates. And, let's extend outside of, just the Middle East here too, and look at other partners around the world that commit real crimes against their own people. The Philippines government, the U.S. has backed them as they waged a brutal and bloody drug war on their own streets where, just executing people for even the alleged use of any kind of narcotics. And then, we can also look at Ukraine, where they're openly waging a cultural war against, 15 or so percent of their own population. The U.S. should not be backing this anywhere in the world. I'm sure if I, really thought about it and looked down the list, particularly with some African governments, Latin American governments, a couple other Eastern European states, you could see significant human rights abuses conducted with American weaponry and with Washington's backing. So everything Biden said there was just complete rhetoric and nothing actually representing threats to the U.S. are what American foreign policy needs. So back to my article here. The bill includes $7.4 billion for several initiatives to increase Washington's military posture in the Indo-Pacific. That includes $2 billion in grants for foreign governments to buy American weapons. Taiwan will receive a portion of that money, but it's unclear what portion that will be. The big chunk of the aid is going to Israel and Ukraine. Very little going to Taiwan. We'll see if this is an issue for the Republicans. Remember that this legislation, the way that it is, the way that the Biden administration drew it up, the goal here was to jam up the right wingers, right? So There's a lot of Republicans in Congress who have bravely and importantly tried to prevent, not a lot, there's been a small number of members of Congress who have bravely and firmly stood against giving more arms to Ukraine, and they've been willing to, hold up the funding for the U.S. government in order to do so. This is fantastic. Now, those same congressmen are not principally anti-war. They don't want America not to be involved abroad. They just don't want America to be involved in Ukraine. And hey, like step one, we're working on you guys. We're getting you there. The problem is that for Washington, for almost anyone in Washington, they're willing to engage in a war they think is bad in order to get a war they think is good. And so I'm guessing that almost all of the Republicans will vote for the bill in order to give aid to Israel and to Taiwan, even if that's just a small amount of aid. So the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Chandra Young, explained that nearly half the money will go to American arms makers. So she says this this supplemental request invests over $50 billion in the American defense industrial base, ensuring our military continues to be the most ready, capable, and best equipped fighting force the world has ever seen. All right, so again, more propaganda here. Spending money and just giving money away to the American military industrial complex does not help the average American. It doesn't create jobs. It doesn't create good paying jobs. What it does is it's just a big money laundering scheme for Washington, where now they're going to have billions of, not probably, hundreds of millions of dollars that are now going to flow from the military industrial complex back into congressional campaigns, into the think tanks, and then, also they're going to hire former congressmen, former American government employees into the military industrial complex. And so really this is just corruption money for Washington. So let's see. Additionally, $14 billion will go towards border security. The White House claimed it will need to keep the southwest border secure to stop this flow of fentanyl. A portion of the funds will go towards hiring thousands of law enforcement officers. And again, this is more red meat for the Republicans, and of course for President Joe Biden. And again, I'm not trying to weigh in personally on, all my thoughts with the immigration issue. I have talked about it in the past on the show some. It's not that I'm afraid to talk about. I just want to stay more, on the subject of foreign policy, since we have so much to talk about right now. However, it's got to be worth noting that the hypocrisy from the Biden administration, who basically ran on the platform that Trump was a Nazi in large part because of his border policy, is now, has already adopted large swaths of Trump's immigration policy to begin with. But it seems like, the White House is just going further and further down that path. All right, before we get into some more news about the war in Israel, I just want to take a minute to talk about two stories we have been talking about on the show. The first is the Baptist hospital bombing. So more reports coming out that seem to confirm the death toll as being upwards of 400 dead. There's a lot of people that express skepticism of that, and I do understand why. When you look at that photo from the day after at the hospital, it certainly doesn't look like a place where 500 people died, where 500 people could have been standing, and based on the size of this crater, it doesn't seem that way. Now, it seems pretty confirmed that hundreds of people died, upwards of 200. There are other hospitals in Gaza who said that they, had an influx of hundreds of patients from the Baptist hospital. And so that's some confirmation. A lot of these international groups that operate in Gaza, these humanitarian groups, have all put the number at upwards of 400 dead. So on that, the casualty count seems right. The controversy around whose missile, rocket, munition it was that caused the explosion is still unclear. On the last episode of the show, I had mentioned that I felt like my analysis from Wednesday held up and I was sticking with it. I still think that's the case. I just want to bring up that there were two reports I saw over the weekend. One was published by CNN, and the one by CNN was interesting. It pointed the finger at Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that was a Palestinian rocket. I don't want to say that it definitely not the case. However, there were things within that CNN article that I do think have been debunked, such as saying that because the crater appeared so small, we know it wasn't a J dam. I think there's a couple issues with this. One, you never know what was standing on top of where that crater was. If there was maybe an ambulance or something. Now, we don't see like a bunch of car parts in the little courtyard area there, so it's not 100% certain easy to say that a car was there and got torn apart, but we also don't know that this is a rocket that even exploded on impact. A lot of rockets will explode in the air, or missiles, munitions can explode in the air, and so it's very possible that this was something that detonated above the ground, and that's why it left such a small impact crater. So I was disappointed with CNN's reporting for that reason. It seemed like, they were really adopting a lot of pieces of the Israeli narrative. Now, something I think we're noting from that article, and something that I have, took a lot of time to try to confirm, it does seem like there's a couple videos, and one was put out by the Israeli military, that does show a barrage of Palestinian rockets being fired at approximately the same time that the Baptist hospital was hit. So, issues with this, of course, are that there's some pretty good analysis, and I forget the name of the group that did it, but they were able to, they look at the impact crater, and then they look at the disbursement of, what direction it seems that the munition was coming in, and it does seem to be coming from the Israeli side. And this would not be impossible for it to be a Palestinian rocket, especially if it malfunctioned. But for it to be a Palestinian rocket, it had to go over the hospital, malfunction, and come back, based on that. And then this was a piece of evidence that I am not sold on, but is very interesting to me because I think it's a critical piece of evidence too. I'm just not quite sure how well the analysis of it holds up. So the Washington Post was able to confirm a video where you hear a, very large sound. A lot of people say it sounds just like a JDAM to them. I don't know. I'm not echoing that claim. I'm just trying to say what I think people will trigger to that video. It's a dark video, and then you could hear a sound of a missile and then an explosion at the Al Baptist Hospital. Now, Washington Post confirmed this video, and so there are people who are able to geolocate where that video was taken and then use Doppler effect to kind of say that this missile was coming from this direction. And so by that Doppler effect analysis, they say that showed that this was coming from the Israeli side. Again, it doesn't make it, I guess, impossible that the rocket went over the hospital, malfunctioned, and came back, although given the noise, I think they say it traveled quite a ways, based on the Doppler effect. Now, in that CNN article in particular, they say they showed that video to an expert who said you can't determine the location based on that. So I honestly am not sure about that piece of evidence yet, but it does seem like it could be critical. And of course, we haven't had any reports of bomb fragments being found either way. If this was a Palestinian rocket or a Israeli one. What was I going to say on that news? Oh, just that I was concerned that there's probably just bomb and munition fragments all over Gaza at this point. And so even if they turn up an Israeli one, a lot of people are going to be rightfully skeptical of that. If they turn up Palestinian ones, again, people will be rightfully skeptical of that. And so I'm getting concerned that there's never going to be a clear truth that comes out of this. And as I mentioned on Wednesday's show last week, that it really might not matter who was actually responsible for this. In a sense, it doesn't matter because once wars start, people die, right? This is why we try to prevent wars to begin with, especially on this show, why we're constantly saying that, the Israelis need to treat the Palestinians better so we don't end up in a situation like this. But that we're well past that now. So at this point, we do look to see who was behind these attacks. But the Israelis and their supporters are going to be convinced that this was a Palestinian attack, and the Palestinian and their supporters are probably going to be forever convinced that this was an Israeli attack. Now, one other thing, more details are coming out about the initial Palestinian raid on Saturday, October 7th. So I have been able to locate and look at some of the videos and images that Hamas did release, that their fighters are reported to have and does believe confirmed to have taken. And there certainly was quite a bit of savagery from the Hamas side. I'm not going as far as to repeat, the Netanyahu claims that we're talking about beheaded babies, but we are talking about here butchered human adults and murdered children. So that certainly happened. Very likely, some of those certainly were committed by Hamas. Now, one other thing to mention on the initial raid, we had a couple Israelis, who have come out and said that I was a captive of Hamas and I was treated all right, or I was even treated, better, of course, than anybody would expect a militant would treat them. And so, that's interesting. And it doesn't appear that whatever happened on October 7th, whatever orders were intended from the Hamas command, they weren't blanketly followed. And even if those orders were kill them all and slaughter the children and do horrible things to their bodies afterwards, not everybody followed those orders. Now, maybe the orders were go kill as many people as possible, or capture as many people as possible, kill the rest that you can, and then come back to Gaza without brutalizing or any other kinds of butchery of people who are dead. And maybe certain commanders in Hamas gave orders not to follow that and to do worse things, or maybe it was the individual fighters that did it. But certainly some really awful things done by Hamas. Now, that doesn't excuse what Israel is doing in any way, and also doesn't take away from the fact that Israel has butchered a lot of people. There are videos out there from, after the Israeli fighters killed some Hamas fighters, of them driving over bodies, desecrating bodies with urine, at least, burning Hamas fighters in large pits, other things that, look, again, these are not, almost all these Hamas fighters are not in any way people deserving of anything, right? Somebody who just killed a child isn't deserving of, a burial. But understand that if you are trying to establish a more calm system, maybe trading those bodies back to Hamas in order for, any dead Israelis in Gaza to be traded back, so everybody can have a burial. Because once people die, the burial isn't about them, it's about their family, it's about the people around them. And even if some young man ended up as becoming a terrorist, going into Israel and butchering a woman, it doesn't mean that his mother and father and all of his siblings aren't going to cry for him still too. And again, allowing some kind of funeral to take place probably would have been could have been a little bit of a healing thing, rather than, again, butchering bodies. And this goes, of course, on both sides. Also want to mention that I have seen reports from Israeli captives who said that at least some of the Israelis that are dead because of the Israeli Defense Forces coming in and just opening fire on everyone, making no effort to rescue hostages. It just, Hamas had 10 Hamas members, and they killed them all, right? Which doesn't really make those deaths not the responsibility of Hamas. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that Hamas isn't responsible for killing those people, because had they not taken those people captive, they'd be alive. At the same time, it's also important to recognize the Israeli tactics here. And acknowledge that some of the people that died in Israel were probably killed by Israeli forces. And look, there are different situations too. The situation described by this one particular hostage in Israeli was bad. It was that the Israeli forces did not have regard for the lives of captured Israelis and killed everyone in order to take out Hamas. And then there are other situations, I'm sure, where say you have, Hamas opening fire on a group of Israeli soldiers and civilians running down the middle path, and Hamas bullets and Israeli bullets just taking out innocent civilians. I'm sure this happened at least some at that rave where over 200 people were killed. It looked like from the videos that we've seen, a lot of crossfire. And so, in that case, it's a lot more understandable to the tactics of the Israeli soldiers, where basically they're just fighting for their lives and civilians are getting caught in the crossfire. Other times, like let's say, like this one was saying they were firing like artillery rounds and things at Hamas with civilians, then that seems a little bit more like you're just not, you don't care if you take out the civilians. All right, let's get into the few stories that I have in news on the war in Gaza today. Blinken rejects idea Gaza ceasefire despite massive child casualties. So this is Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And on Sunday, he rejected the idea of the U.S. calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, Margaret Brennan, the host of CBS's Face the Nation, asked Blinken, UNICEF says 1,524 children have been killed in the Gaza Strip during these bombings. Why isn't the U.S. calling for at least a temporary ceasefire? Blinken claimed that the deaths of children on both sides hits him right in the heart, but did not criticize Israel's vicious bombing campaign. He pointed to the U.S. efforts to get Israel to allow aid trucks to enter Gaza through Egypt, and Brennan asked why the U.S. wasn't pushing for at least a temporary ceasefire. Blinken said, Israel has to do everything it can to make sure this doesn't happen again. Freezing things in place where they are now would allow Hamas to remain where it is and to repeat what it's done sometime in the future. No country could accept that. Now, given that that probably isn't true, also looking at the tactics that Israel is using here, carpet bombing campaigns, unless Israel is willing to kill 95% of the population of Gaza, it's probably going to make a future attack by a militant group like the one Hamas carried out more likely, not less likely, right? Imagine all the young people in Gaza right now who are being radicalized, who are having their lives completely destroyed. I mean, we're talking about reports of dozens of members of one family getting killed. And so, especially if you're a young man who survives that and your mom, your dad, your sisters, your cousins are all dead, your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, everybody is dead. I'm sure the bloodlust that those young men feel is off all charts. And, this is the next generation of Hamas or whatever group of fighters in, Gaza that emerges will continue to fight because of what Israel is doing here. Blinken made a similar argument earlier this year when rejecting the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine ahead of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, saying that a pause in fighting would only benefit Russia. And this is something that we talked a lot about on the show. Daniel Larison at the Quincy Institute always makes this point brilliantly when it comes to sanctions. And I think now we really need to look and realize that this expands to not only the consensus Washington view on sanctions, but has become the consensus Washington view on warfare in general, that anything other than complete victory and complete capitulation by whoever America has deemed as an enemy is too soft to ever make any kind of concessions. And so Russia could come crawling to the diplomatic table. Once Ukraine has driven Russian forces out of the Crimean Peninsula and the Russian people have overthrown Vladimir Putin, sure, then we could talk. But before then, no, because that will benefit Putin. Same thing here. We can't have any kind of ceasefire or anything like that. Forget, just that a couple years ago, the entire policy of the U.S. government was built around the phrase, if it saves one life, if it saves one life, we must do it. Now we're talking about thousands of lives, the lives of thousands of children. And they're saying we can't do it because we'll look weak. So Blinken also went on to tout the aid coming into Gaza, which all the humanitarian rights groups are saying that, look, it's a drop in the ocean. It's not what the people of Gaza need. And Israel isn't allowing in fuel, which is one of the very critical things that particularly the hospitals in Gaza need to continue operating. All right, next up here. Israeli official vows to wipe Iran off the face of the earth if Hezbollah enters the war. An Israeli official vowed that Iran would be wiped off the face of the earth if Hezbollah opens up a war front in northern Israel. Israel and Hezbollah have been trading fire along the Lebanese-Israeli border since October 7th, Hamas attack on southern Israel. There have been dozens of casualties, mainly on the Lebanese side, but Hezbollah has not launched a major assault on Israel. Israel's Minister of the Economy told the Mail on Sunday that if Hezbollah enters the war, Israel would not only eliminate the group but also target Iran. The plan of Iran is to attack Israel on fronts. If we find they intend to target Israel, we will not just retaliate on those fronts, but we will also go to the head of the snake, which is Iran. The warning comes as Israel's ground invasion of Gaza appears imminent. Israel is stepping up airstrikes on the besieged enclave. It has already killed over 4,000 Palestinians, including 1,000 children. Now, my understanding is that the White House is pushing Israel not to conduct the counteroffensive on kind of two reasons. One, they're trying to do everything they can to get any, particularly American hostages, out of Gaza before the Israeli troops go in, because I think they understand that Israel will not prioritize protecting the hostages over killing Palestinians and Hamas. And so that's issue, I think, number one. Or maybe not. Maybe issue number one is this. The U.S. is worried that there is going to be a massive response across the Middle East, from the Houthis in Yemen, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, from Shia militias, and even the Syrian government in Syria, and from the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMFs, the Shia militias in Iraq. There are thousands of American troops that are in range of these groups, and they have rockets that they could fire at Americans. And so I think the Defense Department is doing everything it can to try to rearrange its defense posture in the Middle East, increase the amount of, weapons and different kinds of air defense platforms, all that stuff in the Middle East in preparation for this wider war breaking out, which is concerning for a lot of reasons. One, they have no authorization to do this. If we're supposed to go to war in this country, there should be a declaration of war. There is nothing on the books. This is completely unconstitutional. Number two, they probably don't have enough weaponry and air defenses to actually defend the American troops. And so really what we're talking about here is, making some minor tweaks and adjustments, but not enough to really save the American troops, which again, if they start dying, is going to lead to a massive American war in the Middle East. But also the Joe Biden administration policy was to transfer arms and munitions and personnel and other military assets out of the Middle East so we could confront Russia and China, which, as we talked about, is now a trilateral war plan from the military. We have defense officials saying that we can arm Ukraine, we can arm Israel, and we could fight a war with China. This is insanity. This is dangerous, and the Biden administration is completely off all rails when it comes to talking about what foreign policy should look like. Now, This is from Data Camp on October 22nd, antiwar.com. U.S. sends more air defenses to Middle East as escalation risk rises. Kind of went through all this right there. The attacks are still coming in on U.S. troops across the Middle East. I wouldn't say they're quite daily yet, but certainly weekly, and my guess is that that's only going to increase. Oh, so we did have the Israeli military say one soldier was killed during raid into Gaza. So the Israeli military said they attempted to carry out a raid into Gaza, and one soldier was killed and 3 were injured by an anti-tank missile. During that raid, the statement from the Israeli military came as the armed wing of Hamas said on Telegram that it had repelled an Israeli ground invasion. So seems confirmed from both sides. I'm not sure how much is Israel delaying the ground invasion is because they're nervous about taking casualties, or if it's the other factors, mainly the Americans that are holding them up, that it's really not the Netanyahu government that's concerned about their own soldiers dying in Gaza, or maybe they feel like they need to soften up Gaza a little bit more before they head in. But it's interesting that we have this raid, and that Hamas was able to respond to it. All right, last story up here on today's show. Israel to consider civilians terrorist accomplices if they stay in North Gaza. So your old grandmother that can't walk the, needed dozens of miles to get from North to South Gaza is a terrorist accomplice for staying in the region, according to the Israel government, which means they are not going to and probably rejoice when one of their bombs or one of their bullets ends that woman's life. So the warning was made in a threatening leaflets dropped by Israel drones on Saturday. Urgent warning to residents of Gaza. Your presence north of the Wadi Gaza puts your life in danger. Whoever chooses not to leave North Gaza to the south might be identified as an accomplice of a terrorist organization. Israel previously ordered the evacuation of northern Gaza, an area that is home to 1.1 million people. Since Gaza is under blockade, only a portion of Palestinian of the north are able to flee to the south, which has also come under consistent Israeli embargo. Some Gazans have fled to the south, while others have refused to leave their homes or sought shelter at hospitals, hoping they will not be targets in the Israeli onslaught. But Israel is ordering hospitals be evacuated. According to the Palestinian Red Crescent, Israel ordered the evacuation of the Al-Quds hospital, which is housing more than 400 patients and 1,200 displaced civilians. Since Israel has unleashed its bombing campaign on Gaza in the wake of the Hamas attack, at least 4,651 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including 1,700 children, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. On the Israeli side, 1,405 people have been killed. Gaza is also suffering from food and water shortages due to the Israeli siege. A limited number of aid trucks have been allowed to enter Gaza from Egypt. And by the way, when one of these caravans of trucks was supposed to be entering, an Israeli tank shell hit and wounded 7 Egyptian soldiers on their side of the border. So Israel seems to be interfering to the level they can with any kind of aid entering Gaza. And again, this little bit of aid that is trickling in just is not enough to help 2.3 million people. All right, that will do it on today's show. I'll be back with more later in the week. Thank you all so much for tuning in, continuing to share and put out the show. I really appreciate it.